Good day, everyone. Hope everyone's having a great day wherever you are in the world. My name's Andrew Schachter. I'm the founder and CEO, and I'm here with my colleague Kaitlyn Townsley, who's the Associate Director of Product Innovation. We're going to talk to you today a little bit about randomization and RTSM and creating standards. And wanted to give you a little bit of background about us at Axiom. So Axiom's a global platform in the use of eClinical solutions tailored around all of the different types of requirements, including RTSM. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year and excited at the end to talk a little bit about what we do every day. Kaitlyn, next slide. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about RTSM standards. What are they? Why would we do them? How would you go about creating them? We're going to walk you through a case study on what they're all about and how we get there, and talk a little bit about the importance of how do you deliver the right RTSM solutions, and therefore related to that, how do you find the right partner and the right platform? What are the key questions to ask and to turn over when you think about getting randomization or inventory management done right? Kaitlyn, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So hello, everyone. When we think about starting up our studies and being able to pick up and move over our RTSM standards between projects, there's a lot of different challenges with that. A lot of that comes from the variation between our different study designs, so randomization changes, inventory changes. Even if you work at a company with just one molecule, a lot of these different impacts on study variation can actually change how we pick up and move those standards over. Maybe the study has different blinding requirements. Maybe this time we're doing an unblinded study versus a blinded study. There might be different dispensing schedules. Maybe for one study you're looking at a single dose versus dosing at multiple or between visits. You might have different stakeholders. Maybe you have to work with multiple depots for one trial because you also have a competitor drug or you have a rescue medication involved. And then we might also have some existing or pre-existing company procedures that we need to incorporate as well. So when we think about all of that, it gets a little bit tricky to pick up and move our exact design over every time. But what we want to talk about today is what are the basic standards that we can pick up and move from one study to the next? How can we simplify it as much as we can so that every time we're not creating each project from scratch? We can move over maybe 80% of our plan and we just have to make a few key decisions. That process, as I noted, it's quite difficult. There's lots of decisions that can be made that can have major impacts as to how we're running it and our overall study success. And it's a lot different than just picking up ECRF pages for a clinical study and saying, oh, now we have our demographics and vital signs page. Obviously, there's a lot more implications as we're moving through and developing the RTSM standard. So when we're looking at developing those standards, we want to look at each of the different components of RTSM. So the randomization cohort management piece, as well as the inventory management piece. On the randomization cohort side, are there different ways that we can streamline how our randomization list specifications are set up? If the formats are the same, if they always use the same variables, how we list that out, who produces it, how it's provided to our vendors. On the eligibility data entry, how can we streamline so that every study maybe has the same minimum requirements? You have to do your basics of your consent information, you have to do your demographics, and you have to do your eligibility criteria. Are there other features that could be standardized for most of our studies? Replacement randomization, looking at how we manage cohorts, whether or not we're able to dynamically add cohorts on the fly, etc. On the inventory side, when we're looking at setting up standards, we want to think about our different CTM types. So are we using individualized versus bulk? We should have a plan in place in case we need to use bulk, even though usually we use individual. Can we standardize how we trigger that initial shipment to the site or how the initial inventory is sent to the site? We need to think about the different workflows that might be in place for that inventory, from the shipments with our depot or multiple depots. If there's a streamlined way we can handle our temperature excursions, the same people are approving whether or not those need to be quarantined or released from quarantine, certain ranges, etc. How are we handling our product complaints? Are there certain team members that need to do that at a certain time period? If we can standardize all of those different components, including final disposition of the drug, any other features, so predictive auto resupply, how that's being managed, etc. Standardizing all of these different components is really going to help to make sure that our studies moving forward are as easy to set up as possible.
And Kaitlyn, just an add to that is, the ability to develop things like, if it's a blinded study, what a blinding plan looks like, or how you approach ensuring that for all of your studies, these are all the things you're going to do to ensure that you're protecting the blind across the studies. And the other thing I would add to this list as well is, things like notifications. You will have different requirements for notifications as to who they go to in a study, but you can standardize the language that you want in your notifications by role across the board.
Yeah, great. Great point, Andrew. And terminology is a really important one as well, especially in general when we're looking at all of these different components, because you can see as you look at different studies, maybe in one study you call them enrolled versus one study you call a subject randomized. Even simple little details like that can cause confusion interdepartmentally and with different study teams. So standardizing that language as much as possible in addition to the functionality is certainly critical. In addition to looking at the two components separately, we also want to map it out as a whole. We want to look at the entire workflow, see what aspects we're able to standardize between studies, which parts we need to allow some flexibility for individual studies or even within a study if there needs to be additional flexibility. We also want to think about timing when we're establishing standards. It is great to set out on your first study and say, this is going to be my standard, this is what we're going to do every time, but sometimes the true standards can't actually be identified until we've done 2 studies, maybe 3 studies, so we can see the areas where maybe we didn't take into account an area that would require more flexibility or something that was actually easier to pick up and move to a second study that had different requirements. So mapping out the whole workflow, thinking about when we're doing the standardization process, and then mapping it to both the inventory piece as well as the randomization or cohort piece really is how we establish those standards as a whole. So once we've developed those standards, how do we use them? So most importantly, we find that maintaining all of the key details and tracking our standards is the most important part, of course. But in terms of the key details for context, we want to make sure that we are documenting who had input on these decisions, why we made these decisions, who we had buy-in for, what were some other options that were on the table that maybe we decided not to. That's really important for continuity of our standards, especially as on the sponsor side, you bring in new team members and maybe they say, oh no, it should work this way. If we have a documented way to say we actually went through that whole process and we've already made these decisions, at least we can look at that from that perspective instead of maybe having to rehash decisions that have already been made. Maybe they have a new idea that we never talked about before and might be worth revisiting the standards, but it's helpful just to have that overall context. Secondly, tracking those standards, deciding who's going to own the tracking of the standard specifications, whether that's on the vendor side, on the sponsor side, who's responsible for enforcing that we're actually following those standards. If we're being requested on the vendor side to deviate from those standards, is that the vendor's responsibility to escalate that, or is that something that is being overseen from the sponsor side if there's different teams, for example, requesting different options? So having an overall view as to what the standards are, how we got to them, and who's responsible for enforcing them is all critical in how we use and execute those standards. We also want to make sure that when we're developing the standards and using them, that we're making sure that it makes sense. Yes, there is a great way that we can do it for us on the RTSM side, but we want to make sure we're balancing all of the different components. So we want to look at balancing site burden and sufficient checks to mitigate potential randomization errors. So we want to make sure sites are doing enough data entry to make the subjects eligible, but not so much data entry requirements that maybe it gets too hard for them to randomize a subject on site because they have to have the patient sit there for half an hour while they do data entry. We want to think about different inventory types in our studies. Are those being accounted for? Are we looking at randomized and non-randomized inventory types? And we also want to think about when we're doing that planning, if there's any specifics related to the depot. If I switch depots, what impacts will that have? If I have to use 2 depots for a study, what impacts could that have? So knowing where those key points are that have the different stakeholders involved, where if I make any changes, I know which items to assess, are all critical as well.
Kaitlyn, Kaitlyn, I would add, if you go back a slide for me. I would add then your first point, A, is it's incredibly important. You know, we know that in studies, sites are going to push back. And certain sites will look for sort of the minimum amount of work to get done. But the reality is that we know that documenting RTSM and going through the right process is so incredibly important. So we encourage people not to back down when it comes to implementing the right way to go versus sort of minimizing the footprint to the people that are going to do the work. If it's an extra 5 minutes to be able to get that patient either set up appropriately for randomization, have the right data, or go through the right distribution information for handing out drug or device or supplies of any kind, do it. Because you will pay for it in the end if you cut it down to the bare minimum and then you're sorting through data afterwards to figure out what happened in the study.
Great point, Andrew. Additionally, when we're thinking about new studies, we want to make sure that our standards that we have developed are being taken into consideration from the very beginning of the protocol planning stages. Far too often, we kind of get a notification saying, hey, Clinical's written this new protocol and it's going to be great. And then you open it and it doesn't account for any of the RTSM requirements. They have the bare minimum about our standards of storing our drug, etc., but maybe hasn't taken into the workflow that we've set up. So making sure that for new studies, those standards are brought to the attention of the team members who need to know, and we're thinking about that from the very beginning of protocol planning stages to help the study run better overall. So what we're going to get by developing the standards is a faster startup. We're going to walk through a case study in a moment, but hopefully getting to a point where we just need to tweak a few study specifics for most of our studies. The majority of our decisions have already been made. It's also really helpful to have that continuity between projects because it makes it easier to add new team members or to support other studies with your existing team members. Teaching one overall process to new team members allows them to jump in and help with other projects, and maybe they need to know 3 things about this specific study, but everything else is the same. It really allows you to streamline as our teams scale, and as we have additional projects, allow the resources to be there on the sponsor or CRO side who's helping to manage these tasks. So we're going to walk through a case study together. So in this example, we're looking at an example of a client that was an enterprise client with a large and quickly growing team that had a lot of diverse experience at lots of different companies, but maybe some limited RTSM expertise, and had many studies starting concurrently. This client knew that they had outdated practices and SOPs, and their senior management committed to developing standards on the RTSM tools to make sure that we could start studies easier. So by having the support of upper management, we were able to help develop standards, and we're going to walk through that overall process, how that was completed, and what they saw as the results. So in terms of how we went about doing this, so we had regular meetings set up with the standards team that was defined. I'm going to touch on the standards team in a moment. We have client-specific standard templates that were developed, and then our tracker for the standards as they were. In the standards tracker, we also note all of the studies moving forward to make sure they're aligned with the standards as well. When we look at that overall approach, when we're deciding who's going to participate, we want to make sure we have the right number and the key personnel. We want to have enough people to provide the relevant information from the departments, but we don't want to end up with a whole bunch of extra people and extra opinions in the room if we can do that with a smaller team. So really finding who is most important from each of the respective teams, providing input versus who is optional to attend, and also at what point we bring in those team members. So when we're in the initial planning stages of doing our standards, is everyone required for the brainstorming part? Does everyone participate in the first meeting to put all of their opinions on the table, and then a smaller group navigates those opinions and works through to kind of weed out some options, and then comes back with a smaller list for the full team, just to make it a little bit more effective? Or is your whole team needed and going to be helpful? So thinking through who the key personnel are and how that's going to be a productive conversation. From developing the standards, it was decided in this example that Axiom would be the owner of tracking the standards, so tracking the overall standards and then also ensuring that each study matched those standards. And then figuring out when are going to be the predefined time periods when we're updating those. So in our case, we revisited the standards at the beginning of every study to make sure everything was aligning with the standards, and then also at the end to see if we had to make any mid-study changes that impacts maybe our standards, maybe how we managed it for this project, relative to the standards, etc. But making sure that there is a designated team responsible for that. So it was tracked by Axiom, and then the sponsor was overseeing, in this example, to ensure that that was happening as well. So what happened? So because of our standards, what we found is that the sponsor had a much easier management of studies with new RTSM requirements. We found that there were decreased rounds of UAT for new studies. This was so critical for this client. In their initial UATs for their projects, they required their IT team to be involved, their QA team to be involved, their clinical team to be involved, and their RTSM team to be involved on their side. So by decreasing the number of decisions that were being made on a per project basis, we could cut out the IT team, the QA team. The clinical team only had to look at one or two aspects, and then just the RTSM team had to do their review as well. So it was a huge win to be able to cut down the rounds of UAT for their new projects. They also found it was a lot quicker to actually complete that review, whether that was review of the specifications or the review during the UAT process or pre-UAT, because there were fewer decisions for them to make on each study. So overall, this led to much quicker startup times.
And Kaitlyn, I would just add, sorry, I was going to say, Kaitlyn, on the previous slide, is they're no longer rehashing the same discussion in every meeting. And that's costing a massive amount of money to repeat the same conversation over and over again across 5-10 team members plus vendors.
Definitely. Yeah. A huge time savings in terms of how we're using our time to get through that startup process. So what that overall came down to, we ended up getting to a point where they only really make 2 decisions per study. They need to make a decision based off of the depot, whether that's going to be a third party or if the sponsor is that depot, and there's one other piece that was study specific. Everything else was streamlined for them so that they could manage those on a regular basis. So really, really great to see all of that work product come down to just 2 decisions. We were also fortunate that we had multiple studies to start our standards from. So we started with looking at 2 studies that we were working on with them and streamlined from there. Had we had the first study only, we wouldn't have had as much information. So starting at 2 studies was really good to be able to move forward. So when we think about how to find that RTSM partner for your sponsor, excuse me, we want to think about understanding the sponsor's needs, understanding the vendor's capabilities, what the overall support level will be from the vendor, data access, as well as agility or our time to go live. So on the sponsor side, really understanding your needs as best as you can and clearly communicating that via the RFP really helps ensure that you're aligning your internal stakeholders on your side. Make sure that you have accurate quotes for what functionality you actually require to minimize change orders later on in the project. And it really ensures that the overall partnership is a good fit for both parties. When you're looking at that vendor, you want to make sure that they have the technology capabilities that you'll actually use. Are you looking at an IRT provider? Are you looking for an EDC with a separate IRT? Are you looking for one platform that has both? You also want to look at options for standalone versus EDC and additional modules, maybe for different studies. Flexibility to support during global pandemics that come up. If they have the additional features available to move to direct-to-patient shipping in that case, etc. So really understanding the breadth of the technology that you're investing in so that even if you only need a small component of it now, as you scale your program and additional items might be helpful in managing that process, are those available to scale and grow with you as a company?
Kaitlyn, I would throw one other comment to that. I think there's a challenge, and I put this out to anyone watching this and attending this conference. You shouldn't be presented with a 200 or 300 page document to be able to figure out your RTSM. You just shouldn't. I think the way the materials are being prepared, it's so easy for mistakes to occur because the documents are so complicated that it's next to impossible for people to figure them out. 150, 160 page spec document, something's going to get lost. So if you're not getting information that's clear and concise, you can expect problems to occur because you'll never find everything that's sort of buried in a structure like that. So something to consider.
Great point, Andrew. The next item here, just looking at support. What's the support level that you need from your vendor? Do you need more support during startup? Do you need hands-on information consulting? Maybe you don't have an IRT specialist on your side and you need someone to really provide a lot more guidance and direction rather than just execution. What's the ongoing support needed? Is it just IRT management, customer care, or support desk for different team members? And then do you have the overall data access with this vendor that you need? A lot of times we see that there isn't a full transparency of the data and whether or not you have that access. So what are the reporting standards? What's your ability to customize reports? Are they available in real time? Do you need to request reports? What's the end of study output look like? Are they providing you the SAS data sets formatted to SDTM as needed, etc. So really thinking about all of those overall requirements. Just in the interest of time, we're going to skip through a little bit, but Axiom provides everything we noted. We have a platform to support the randomization and inventory management, as well as a dedicated team in-house to manage and support any requirements you have. So we have a dedicated team that focuses on just the RTSM components of the technology. So when you look at the full Fusion platform, it is a fully clinical suite. So all of the EDC, ECOA, safety, etc. requirements, CTMS. But the RTSM part stands alone to us with an individual team managing that so that you do have the dedicated expertise while still getting all of the benefits of a unified platform.
Thanks everybody for joining our session today. Kaitlyn, great job.
Thanks everyone.